Hi, everyone. My name is Billy Mitchell. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in Chelsea Hillian's lab at Temple University. I'm sorry I can't be there with you all in person today to present this, but I'm going to be presenting my research using naturalistic approaches to study how we regulate emotion in some high-intensity dynamic situations. If you do have any questions throughout, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at my email address. So one of the broad motivations for this project was differences in what we can consider theory, or what we measure in ideal controlled conditions, and practice, or what we observe in dynamic, complicated daily life. Most of the time when we study emotions and emotion regulation, we're doing so in relatively ideal conditions and usually in controlled, isolated lab environments. For example, you may be familiar with Gross's process model. It posits that self-regulation can be categorized into different strategies based upon when self-regulation is applied in the time course of an event. So these 5 strategies have different strengths, weaknesses, and costs as a result. We often test this process model theory via stimulus response paradigms, during which participants are first trained in different strategies and then shown a preview of an emotionally evocative, often negative, often unimodal stimulus. Subjects receive a prompt to regulate their emotions and then must choose one of 2 available regulation options. They then regulate their emotions in response to that image and report the effects of that self-regulation. And through these paradigms, we've learned quite a bit about the strengths of these strategies and the situations in which they best fit. For example, there's a robust relationship between how intense an emotional experience is and which strategies we choose to regulate those emotions with. So distraction is not only chosen more often when emotional intensity is high, but also tends to be more effective at reducing or downregulating high intensity negative emotions than reappraisal is. This suggests, for example, that if you're feeling very bad at the loss of a loved one, focusing your attention on something else might be better at reducing those negative feelings than trying to change the meaning of or how you interpret that loss. These strategy strengths matter quite a bit because failed self-regulation not only means you didn't meet your goal, but it can also have rebound effects, leaving you feeling worse than you had in the first place. If the emotion that we're trying to regulate is simply mild disappointment that the subway is running late, it might not matter very much if you fail to regulate in the long run. But how we keep our cool can be much more important in highly stressful, very intense situations, perhaps if we're feeling threatened or unsafe. But there's a gap in the research here. The stimulus response paradigm prioritizes internal validity, so the extent to which those relationships translate to more complicated life events is unclear. For one, the events in our lives when self-regulation can really matter can be intense and aversive to a degree that these stimulus response paradigms often fall short of. Events in our lives can also be unpredictable, making it difficult to prepare an appropriate response. We don't often get training or explicitly prompted to self-regulate. The events we care about also unfold over longer time courses than we often can allow for in our studies. And lastly, events and our response to those events can be really complex. Events can be compounded, sensations can be multimodal, binary choices might not adequately represent natural self-regulation tendencies. And ecological momentary assessment approaches do address some of these concerns, but many still train participants in self-regulation, encourage subjects to focus on emotion regulation, and often have difficulty consistently capturing emotion regulation during these high stress events. And so what we wanted to do with this project was examine self-regulation usage when subjects aren't trained, when they aren't constrained to 2 strategies, when researchers don't prompt them to regulate, and when they're in less controlled but more stressful conditions than what had been done in the past. Given the strength of the relationship between intensity and regulation strategy choice in controlled settings, our working hypothesis was that affective intensity should positively predict the use of distraction over reappraisal. However, that's not quite what we found. So we initially tested this hypothesis by running 2 experiments at a highly regarded haunted house in Philadelphia called Eastern State Penitentiary. Haunted house experiences have been recently used by some other researchers for similarly affective questions because they do possess many of those previously mentioned features. They can feel dangerous and chaotic while still being safe and controlled. Participants can have a relatively naturalistic experience with limited researcher intervention. Participants witness very consistent performances from highly trained actors, and in our case, The Haunted House gave us special access to guarantee this for our study. And lastly, themed sections offer a wide variety of stimuli to elicit varied emotions. Despite these strengths, a common concern is that haunted houses are often designed to be entertainment, so subjects might be experiencing amusement and not really regulating. However, we found that self-reported haunted house enjoyment negatively predicted how frequently subjects regulated their emotions, and that individuals who are more easily startled reported self-regulating more frequently while in the haunted house too. So subjects who we might expect to need to self-regulate in this setting were self-regulating as expected without any prompts to do so. Additionally, as state anxiety increased, subjects reported putting more effort towards trying to self-regulate, and participants also increased their regulation efforts as the affective intensity that they reported increased as well. So all these findings together did seem to suggest that self-regulation is following some predictable patterns in this setting. To set up the experiment, subjects traversed the 45-minute haunted house experience in small groups accompanied by a research assistant. Subjects were instructed to not touch one another, to stay in a single file line, and to not discuss their experience until after reporting, but to otherwise experience the haunted house as they naturally would. They were not told that this was an emotion regulation study and were not trained to use any strategies. Instead, after completing the haunted house, each participant self-identified events from within the haunted house that were most emotionally salient to them. They then reported which emotions they felt, how intense those emotions were, and how they attempted to self-regulate, if at all, in their own words. The regulation descriptions were reviewed by hypothesis-blind independent raters who were trained using landmark literature from the emotion regulation field. These raters classified each event as containing either reappraisal, distraction, both strategies, or neither strategy. And both sets of raters demonstrated pretty strong agreement in their classifications, as you can see here and here. There were a few minor differences between study 1 and 2, which I've also noted within these boxes. And from here, the analyses were relatively simple. Using multi-level binary logistic regression, we examined the association between reported emotion intensity and strategy usage during every event in which either reappraisal or distraction was described. So on our x-axis, we have the self-reported emotional intensity of the event, which was captured on a 5-point Likert scale. And on our y-axis, we have the probability that the event was regulated via distraction, with 1 representing a definitive use of distraction and 0 representing a definitive use of reappraisal. Both strategies failed to yield any significant association between intensity and strategy usage. Visualized here, we can see the results for study 2, and study 1 mirrored this pretty closely as well. This was true even when adjusting for covariates, including cognitive load at the time of exposure, sex, and biases in how people choose regulation strategies. And so to try to be as generous as possible to this established hypothesis, we also took a multiverse approach, running the analysis multiple times while changing the inclusion criteria. This included including and excluding observations featuring positive and negative emotions, strategies beyond just distraction and reappraisal, and the time at which the data was collected. None of these changes produced a model in which intensity significantly predicted strategy usage after adjusting for multiple comparisons. This is obviously quite a turn from expectations, but perhaps what is more interesting is that we found that this deviation might be at least partially explained by how successful the two strategies were in this setting. So when subjects were asked to self-report how successful their strategy use was, we found reappraisal matched the pattern established in previous studies fairly well, being more effective at lower intensities than at higher intensities. However, distraction was markedly less successful at higher intensities, which is significant because this is exactly when distraction should be more successful. This likely reflects the features or affordances of the situation. So putting yourself in the shoes of the subjects, you can imagine it might be difficult to use distraction when so many loud, chaotic, and attention-grabbing things are fighting for your attention. However, we contend that these features co-occur with high-stress situations quite often, and thus this may represent a common experience of trying to self-regulate in these situations. These findings do suggest that environmental affordances could overshadow the effect of emotional intensity in situations with features that mirror this one, even though the effect size of intensity and strategy choice appears so large elsewhere. And so to explore this further, we examined how people might self-regulate in response to similar content, but presented when affordances likely more closely match lab studies. To do this, we recruited 253 subjects online via Prolific and mirrored many aspects of the first two studies, but again, in a more controlled setting. So the participants each watched 4 2-minute video clips sourced from lesser-known horror films. These clips had been selected from a pool of videos, which were evaluated by 50 independent raters. The clips were selected because they were balanced in terms of valence and popularity, but were rated as either high or low intensity by the raters. Subjects were instructed to complete the study in isolation, and the task ensured that no other windows were visible and that the sound was audible throughout the experience. And emotion regulation was again not explicitly referenced in recruitment for this study to avoid priming subjects. Before and after each video, experienced negative affective intensity was assessed on a sliding 100-point scale. And after all videos were watched, subjects were assigned to either an experience or a forecasting condition, in which they reported either how they used self-regulation during these videos or how they predict somebody would self-regulate while watching these videos. Participants were provided with definitions of these strategies and completed an exercise to ensure comprehension. However, participants were given the option to not select distraction or reappraisal to deviate from the forced choice binary nature of previous work. We anticipated that forecasting relative to actual usage might look more similar to what we see in lab studies. The rationale for this being that what stimulus response paradigms task participants with doing might be considered simulating self-regulation usage more so than actual usage. Again, we see intensity on the x-axis and the probability of regulating via distraction on the y-axis. And what we found was that both conditions certainly mirror previous studies, with higher intensity experiences being more likely to be regulated via distraction. However, there is once again an interesting distinction between how individuals forecast or predict somebody might regulate, and the regulation response individuals actually report using, which is represented in red. The selection of reappraisal and distraction were evenly distributed among forecasters, which reflects the balanced intensity of our stimuli. However, experiencers favored reappraisal at the expense of distraction, which we see more clearly here. A chi-square test found that the experiencer's bias towards reappraisal was significantly different than forecasters' use of the two strategies. Or, in other words, experiencers use distraction less often than forecasters predicted a person would use distraction. Lastly, when assessing how much subjects believed their selected strategy reduced or would reduce their negative affective intensity on that sliding 100-point scale, predictions and experiences of reappraisal were nearly matching. But forecasters predicted that distraction would be more effective than experiencers actually reported that it was. This again illustrates this trend of distraction being less beneficial in these high-intensity, high-stress situations than what we might expect based upon other research. There's obviously still so much work left to do in this space, but these studies at least seem to suggest that these dynamic, feature-rich study designs provide an opportunity to study self-regulation with less researcher intervention or direction, that studying self-regulation in these dynamic designs might yield result patterns that differ quite a bit from the lab, and that in these high-intensity situations, specifically, distraction might not be as effective as expected. We cover many, many more details in the manuscript, which is currently available as a preprint. I was really hoping to finally have it published by the time this came around. I think we're very, very, very close. We just need a little bit more time, but keep an eye out for that. A few things to keep in mind are that self-selection bias was very likely present in a study that was recruiting to have participants go through a haunted house. Additionally, while the setting might incorporate more dynamic and complex features, it is still fundamentally an artificial environment. Running field studies of this time can be very expensive, and this project was only possible because of NSF funding. And then lastly, with such rich qualitative data, a lot of work is required to clean it, and there are many researcher degrees of freedom that can be exercised. So a detailed pre-registration or plan should be used to appropriately justify and document these decisions when possible. In conclusion, sorry once again that I can't be there with you all, but thank you all for your attention. Thank you to the folks who organized this symposium. Thank you to my research team. And if anyone is looking for a postdoc in the Philadelphia area, I'm looking for a place to take my K00 funding. So again, thank you all very much for your time.